Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I asked a while back if anyone would like to see an updated comparison of the arcade and Genesis versions of Strider, and you guys overwhelmingly said yes. So let it not be said that I ignore the will of the people. You might think I just decided to redo the video exactly like I did the original over 4 years ago, and if you think that, well, you're wrong! I decided to make this one meaningfully different from the original by making it my first all FPGA edition of utterly pointless comparisons. Both of these games are running on their most recent Mr. cores on a Mr. Pi. Now I was going to appear on camera for this one like the old days, but thought, nah, I'll do that for something else that makes sense later on. Like normal though, let's take a look at the specs of the arcade versus the Genesis/Mega Drive here while I give you a brief rundown of Strider. Capcom Strider hit the arcade in 1989 on their mighty CPS1 hardware, and it was an action game unlike any other. It was short with only 5 brief levels, but it was filled with complex action and spectacle like no other game before it. The arcade version was a fantastic game, despite the fact that people have been trying to rewrite history over the last few years and act like Strider is some terrible mess or something. But I'm telling you, ignore the haters. Strider is amazing and might be the single best straight-up 2D action arcade title ever made. Sega brought Strider home to the Genesis in 1990, and it was an absolutely fantastic conversion of the arcade game. As I mentioned in the original video 4+ years ago, this version won EGM's 1990 Game of the Year award, and it deserved it. Now, it's not perfect, and it never could have been, especially considering the Genesis's lower resolution, fewer colors, fewer sprites, and fewer available backgrounds than Capcom CPS1 hardware. Still, what Sega achieved with this particular version of the game was absolutely phenomenal for the time. Famously, and advertised right on the box, it was the first 8 megabit Genesis/Mega Drive game. Also, Yuji Naka worked on this one, and Sega had access to the arcade game's code and assets. Alrighty, recording methodology before we jump in. I just played both games straight through, but because save states weren't available, I did things a little differently here. First up, I decided to keep the only death I had in the arcade version in the video, so you'll see that in level 5. It was bad luck, but what can you do? The game is loaded with RNG. For the Genesis version, I spliced together 3 different runs, since because of that RNG, on a few different levels I ended up doing things a little bit differently in some of the Genesis playthroughs and taking extra time versus the arcade version, which would have meant more and longer pauses in the video comparison. I finished several playthroughs on the Genesis/MV title with my total death count ranging from 0 to 3 per run if I remember right. Remember, it's not about my gameplay, it's about comparing the games. Alright, let's get on with it. Alright, and we're underway. So we'll see the Genesis version. I started it a split second earlier because it takes it a while to catch up because there's a black screen there, just for a quick moment. And as you can see, the background looks like it's moving a lot faster on the Genesis, but that's because it eliminates the further scrolling layer, since it only has 2 layers instead of 3. Now we have the lights, we've got, the buildings. The star field is less impressive on Genesis because it's just part of the second layer, and you can see the ornate structures holding up the platforms are not as nice either. So we get into this part on the Genesis, we've got sort of a plain background for just a little bit, so it does not look as detailed as the arcade version here. And for some of the things, you'll notice there are just extra tiles with a little more detail on them in the arcade version as you go along. That's because, they have much more memory and stuff on the arcade version, so they had more space to store all these tiles. And, on the Genesis, we've also got that lower resolution, so a lot of the tiles had to be redrawn. It looks like some may not have been, they may have just moved them over, which makes them look wider. Now, why does that happen? Well, the resolution of the CPS1 hardware is quite a bit larger across. It's got like an extra 60-ish pixels on the horizontal plane versus the Genesis. As we go through here, you can see that building in the background. Well, it's not really a building at all in the Genesis. They just kind of simulated the look of a building. So we don't have, the structure itself with the stars and everything and the, clearly defined walls. In the foreground, we've got a lot less detail on that building, but the general shape is there, so it's pretty clear what it is. And for this comparison, I'm going to have to go pretty quick through a lot of this stuff because this is a fast game. I'll try and squeeze in some more specifics in various other sections of the game that are a bit on the longer side. Again, you can see a lot more detail in the arcade version here, especially with the partially destroyed building. More of it's missing on the Genesis. And as we head into the last section here, the destruction happens a little more gradually as we go down in the arcade version, and you can see there are more tiles with different levels of destruction. Here we go for our Ouroboros enemy. We get in there, and then we just get behind it and whack it to death. Tried to get the same frame there. I did on one of my playthroughs, but the rest of the playthrough wasn't as good, so I didn't keep it. Now you're going to hear the Genesis version here on the cutscenes. The cutscenes happen faster in the arcade version, but on the Genesis version, they often have different music than they did in the original. One thing I sadly had to cut out here is you get Peter Cullen. He does the voice saying, "I got you," and he was, of course, famous for voicing Optimus Prime in Transformers. As we start level 2, we can see the foreground layer is a lot less detailed than the Genesis version of the game. Also, in the arcade, we can see through the holes there's some background, and there is a second layer of parallax scrolling. On the Genesis, this part is only one layer for some reason. Why? I couldn't tell you. We've also got some of those instances where the game pauses for a very brief second to load on the Genesis. It happens, periodically throughout. Now you can see on these wheels here, things look a lot different in the arcade version. There's a lot more animated tiles going on in the background there. We get a much greater sense of the actual, shape of the wheel and its spinning and everything. On the Genesis, we don't really get that. There are also differences in collision detection here between the arcade and Genesis one, especially with the little piece of metal you can hang on at the bottom of this area. Alright, and then as we head up, you can see once again a lot more detail in the foreground layer in the arcade. Genesis version has a very plain background at this point. There's no stars and it's all one color instead of having two colors here. And the mountain itself, they managed to really capture the feel of the scene in the Genesis version, I'll give it that. There's not quite as much detail and color in the background or foreground layer. And as we get into this last section with sort of the power plant type area, there's a lot less variety in the tiles and the snow-covered stuff in the Genesis release. Now in the arcade version here, the lightning is a lot larger. There is some animation going on with the tiles in the backgrounds. There's some lightning strikes in the background that are not present in the Genesis version either. And as we head up to the next section, where we gotta jump on these tiny little copter platform things, pretty close on both. You get the super annoying bombs dropping down. Each version has a maximum of 4 on screen at one time, so there's no real difference there. You can see the arcade version, the color's a little bit darker on these backgrounds, but that's really the only major difference, other than, the higher resolution makes the angles on the little copter platforms a little less severe in the arcade version, I would say. The other thing I'll point out here is the redrawn Strider sprite on the Genesis. And again, they had to redraw it, because if they used the sprite from the arcade version and just plopped it down as is with no changes, it would have been way too wide. You get sort of the same effect as when you see Genesis titles ported straight to the Super Nintendo, and they drop games that were originally 320 pixels wide down to 256. Everything looks fatter. Sega wanted to avoid that here, so they completely redrew the Strider sprite, along with a lot of other things. And here you can see we lose out on a lot of the gradual, shading that's in the arcade version, which is too bad, but again, the Genesis has a way smaller total color palette available, and is capable of showing way fewer on screen than the arcade version. Alright, and here's our next cutscene. All of these are completely redrawn as well. None of these were, taken from the arcade version and just plopped on. They were redrawn from scratch. And now here's where we have a difference in sound. So in the Genesis version, we get, original music for each stage. It doesn't repeat, in any of the stages. In the arcade original release, the level 1 music plays in levels 1, 3, and 5, and is also repeated during the ending. Now there were later revisions of the arcade version of Strider that included the same music that we hear in the Genesis versions of levels 3 and 5. But they came out afterwards. They were not part of the original arcade release of Strider. Now here, you can see that everything is a lot wider on Genesis, and we also have, fewer details. So, it looks like for some things in this area, Sega may have just plopped down the original tile set. Now, if we look over here on this part, we have a difference where there's an extra background layer on the Genesis that's not present in the arcade version. I'll also notice here that the invincibility power-up looks completely different in both versions of the game. In the arcade game, Strider glows and has multiple shadows that, copy his moves. In the Genesis version, we just blink with invincibility for a little bit of time. There we had another load pause on the Genesis version, and we've already seen a few of those at this point. And then we head into the famous first anti-gravity area in Strider. where we'll be walking on the ceiling very shortly. And I thought for sure my sword was going to get that missile attack. Oh well, things happen, what can I say? Again, Sega did a fantastic job with this. And I do think, you know, that in a lot of this part they probably did use the original arcade tiles, because some of these details look too close for them to have completely redrawn them, and the things are wider. So that, you know, the fact that the stuff is wider is probably the closest giveaway, you know, that you can see there. Now, this is one section that looks a lot different and plays a lot different, and I'll explain why in a second. First, as far as the looks go, tremendous amount more detail in the arcade version. In the Genesis, there's a lot of empty black space here, and, you know, there's way fewer tiles and a lot less shading. And you'll notice in the arcade version, as I rotate around this satellite thing, it's very fast. On the Genesis version, as soon as this thing shows up and then sucks us into its gravity well, we're pretty much in a constant state of slowdown. So we're basically running at what appears to be about half the speed of normal gameplay while that's going on. And then we get a quick load after we destroy it, and again we see a lot less detail in the tiles here, both in the foreground and in those background clouds. But still, great job overall. I'm not knocking the Genesis version here. I think it's absolutely clear that the developers and artists and everyone involved in working on the Genesis version of Strider really wanted to create something special. And that's the end of Stage 3, by the way, so get ready to move on to Stage 4. Alright, here we go, Stage 4 in the Amazon. This is another area where we'll see a pretty big difference in some of the background tiles, especially this tree that's coming up here in the background. It's very detailed in the arcade. In the Genesis, it's a simpler repeating pattern. Again, we've got a little bit more slowdown here, a little bit more flicker on the Genesis. Depends on exactly how much you have on screen at one time in that version as to how much slowdown and flicker you'll see. But there's a lot of slowdown in the arcade version on this part too, as you can clearly see. Now, Capcom had already had some experience with the CPS1 hardware by the time they developed Strider, since it was their third game on the platform. However, even arcade Strider is plagued by a lot of slowdown and flicker and stuff that we wouldn't really see in many of their later games on the same platform. I'm not saying their later games had none of that stuff, but they definitely got better with experience. Another quick load section there on the Genesis. Now we get into this part with the dinosaurs, which is kind of funny. There's a thing that you might not notice here. First off, again, way fewer background tiles on Genesis. But if you look at the dinosaurs, which I guess are supposed to be brontosauruses, which, you know, people say now weren't even a thing, that they were all brachiosaurs, on the Genesis, their feet are obscured by some of the bushes here in the foreground. In the arcade, you can see their legs and feet. And they said in an interview for the Genesis version that they couldn't do that. They couldn't have all that stuff moving on screen at once because of various limitations of the hardware. And now as we fight the boss here, I had to play this quite a few times to recreate that arcade scene on the Genesis where we just keep hitting the thing even when we're not making contact. You can do it in both versions, but it's not easy. One other thing I'll take the opportunity to mention here during this final cutscene is that there's a lot of bugs and glitches in both versions of Strider. But in the Genesis version, there's a few more. There's some extra places where you can fall through floors or in the scenery, or you just tumble away and get stuck in scenery, tumbling forever. It doesn't happen a lot, but if you've played this game as many times as I have over the years, you will encounter it. Alright, so here we start our fifth and final level. Once again, way fewer colors. We have a much smoother gradient in the arcade version than we do on Genesis. They still absolutely managed to retain the look and feel, though. No question about that. I wish they had gone maybe just a smidge darker with the background instead of choosing a medium tone for it, but it looks alright. Now this part coming up here is probably the biggest difference between the two versions of the game when it comes to gameplay. You're going to see in the arcade, I make a pretty mad dash from here to the next satellite room. On the Genesis, you really can't do that. There are parts you have to stop and wait. Or at least if you do it, you'll get hit, you'll do some tumbling, and it's a little harder to control, and make things, work the way you want them to. So again, I just want to mention that in the Genesis version of Strider, we get several unique songs that play as part of Level 5, while in the original arcade release of Strider, it just repeats the Level 1 music in each of these sections. But I do want to point out again that later revisions of Arcade Strider do have these songs that we're hearing on the Genesis version included. As you can see, we get slightly different patterns for some of those moving spikes. And then as we get into the next satellite area, once again, there is tremendously more detail in the background in the arcade here than there is in the Genesis version. You can already see the Genesis version struggling to keep up with speed. Started to slow down even before I started rotating around the satellite. And then as soon as I get sucked up by it and into its gravity, yep, we're running about half speed just like we were in Stage 3. And there's my one lone death in the arcade version right there, because I got stuck to the wall that I didn't mean to. And there's also one of my cuts in the Genesis version. I'm not trying to hide anything. So, we get there, and we move on here. We can see we've got way more detail in the background again, in the arcade original there. And here, in the arcade, you can see all those, lights and structures in the background are a second scrolling layer. On the Genesis, there's only one layer on this part. And I find that really weird. I'm not sure why they did that, since they could have easily, handled a second layer here. Now we will see the Genesis layer become a parallax layer later on as we get past, this little boss gauntlet here. Now in the Genesis version, when you destroy the mechanized ape, the Tyrannosaurus, also dies. In the arcade version, that doesn't happen. You've got to kill the Tyrannosaurus. Usually at least. And here we've got a lot of slowdown on the Genesis with this boss. For anyone that cares, this boss's name is Lago, or originally in Japanese, Lago Mechanic. And I will say that the pattern and gameplay feel of almost everything here, is very close in both versions. Now for the Ouroboros that shows up here again, one other thing I want to point out that I didn't earlier on, is you can see in the arcade version, it has a much flatter, cartoonier look. It actually has a more shaded, slightly more realistic look in the Genesis version of the game. And here they cut out some of the text, and the speech. In the arcade version we get speech there where it says, "All sons of old gods die." In the Genesis version they got rid of both the text and the speech. But as far as the speech goes, they wouldn't have had room for that on the cartridge anyway, so no big loss there. So you can see at this point the parallax layer finally does kick in as everything scrolls down, and we jump across and make our way towards the game's final boss, Grand Master Mayo. And there's going to be one slight difference in the ending here too. Well, not the ending itself, but the little ending scene inside the gameplay before we get to the ending cutscene. So there, we see the sun come up around the Earth on the arcade version, but not the Genesis one. But don't worry, we'll get to see that at the end of the supremely long Genesis ending, which is totally different. Here in the arcade version, we once again get the level 1 music as it goes through the credits. Here for the Genesis, we get an ending that has been compared a little bit more to the Revenge of Shinobi ending, and part of the reason for that is the designer of this ending is apparently, according to interviews, the same guy who worked on the ending for Revenge of Shinobi, so kinda makes sense there. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about what we learned while we wait through the supremely long Genesis ending here. So for the music differences, I'm gonna say that a lot of the times I prefer the soundtrack in the Genesis one. They're both really good, but there's sort of a mushiness to some of the arcade soundtrack where the stuff just sounds clearer on Genesis. As for other versions of Strider, we already talked about the X68000 version, which I mentioned was closer to the CPS1 original, which is unsurprising considering the hardware similarities between the X68000 and the CPS1 platform. Now we also had the PC Engine arcade card version, which I did another comparison of earlier, and that one is really subpar despite the fact that it came out years later. It's markedly worse than the Genesis version in just about every possible way. As far as regional differences go between the Japanese and US versions of Strider, the Japanese version has the extra voice effect of Strider going "ha" every time he swings his sword, and it is super annoying, and I am very glad they took that out of the Western version of the game. There are also more bugs and glitches in the original Japanese version of the game than there are in the corrected US release. One other thing I didn't point out too much while it was happening is some of the flicker we see in the Genesis version, or sprites disappearing. Just in the last stage here, when I was standing on top of that Ouroboros, when you're standing still on him on the Genesis while he's forming, you'll see that Strider's feet disappear. So we have things like that. Still, I don't want to sound overly critical here. This was a fantastic port of Strider, and I'm completely comfortable using the word port since Sega received pretty much all of the assets and game code and even the background material that Capcom used to create this game. Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier on in the video that's really bothered me is this trend I've seen online of people trying to denigrate this game and, say it was less important than it was and that it's not a good title, which is just not true, and I've seen it compared unfavorably to derivative tripe like Run Saver on the Super Nintendo. And I really just don't get this, I'll call it, movement to say that games that were fantastic, that got great reviews back in the day, that won awards like Game of the Year awards, were just flat out bad, and it doesn't make sense to me. Strider is fantastic. It is a game for the ages. There is still really not anything else like it. I mean, the closest thing we have is Ken & Dancer Husband, which was made by a lot of the same people that worked on this, and that's a game I covered in another video. It was only released in the arcade, it's nowhere near as good as Strider, it doesn't really have an appealing look, and the music is kind of terrible in it, but the gameplay is somewhat similar to this one. So if you really loved Strider and wanted to see the closest thing it ever got to a real sequel back in the day, you can look at that, but I don't think most people will be satisfied with it. It's more of an interesting curiosity. As for Strider's own sequels, the US Gold-developed Strider Returns is absolute garbage on all platforms, and Capcom's own Strider 2 really just failed to capture the magic of the original in my opinion. But alright, let's go ahead and get this thing all wrapped up now, shall we? So there you have it, a complete comparison of arcade and Genesis/Mega Drive Strider on what people say is the most accurate hardware recreations possible. Now, I'm not an FPGA snob by any stretch, so I'm not going to say this is the ultimate and only way to play these games, but it's definitely an interesting way to take a fresh look at them, which was the purpose of this video. In the end, arcade Strider obviously has way more muscle and is more visually impressive, but the Genesis/MD version really hangs in there, and you can see why it was such an impressive and important game at the time it came out. Sure, it loses quite a lot of things in a direct one-to-one comparison. It has the status bar at the top of the screen that's blocked off. It's got one fewer layer of background scrolling, far fewer sprites, a noticeably lower resolution, fewer colors, more flicker, and more slowdown than the CPS1 release. But remember, this was a Genesis game from 1990. There was no arcade game at home that was more impressive than Strider on the Genesis at the time of its release. It was recent, and it was really close to the original. It truly felt like you were playing the arcade game at home with the Genesis version of Strider. In the end, I imagine if it had been made a little later, we'd probably have a slightly larger and more accurate version with more of the arcade game's tile set implemented and less slowdown and flicker. But make no mistake, the Genesis/Mega Drive version of Strider was easily the best home version of Strider we'd see in the West for a good long while. In Japan, they received the X68000 port in 1992, but remember, you needed a $3,000 plus computer to play that on, and frankly, while it's a great port, I don't think it's worth the price of the hardware gate. Now, as for the FPGA experience on these via Mister as of March 2025, it was fine. Mister's archaic menu system isn't the most user-friendly experience in the world, and the lack of save states definitely made recording similar gameplay for every level in the game more challenging than usual. Yet the controls felt noticeably lighter and more responsive than playing via emulator, even on a higher-end PC. But the thing is, I don't think the vast majority of people would even notice that in the case of this game. Any diehard Strider fan will notice the difference, and will probably prefer playing the game on Mister to something like RetroArch on another platform. Personally, I say go ahead and play the game however you enjoy it best. There's no right way to do that. It's all what works best for you. I certainly won't say that it's not worth playing via regular software emulation because it definitely is. Alright dear viewers, it's your turn. What did you think about seeing a comparison video using all FPGA based hardware? Is this something you want to see me do again in the future? Is it something that you don't feel makes really any difference at all? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like super thanks and channel memberships. I will add that this video was only possible because of support I received from you guys through the years, since I used some of that money to purchase a Mr. Pie. Alright, with that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.